6 o'clock. The factory bell hasn't even finished ringing, and already the gates are swinging open. Men are pouring out in overalls stained with a week's worth of grease and sweat, and every single one of them is holding the same thing, a small brown envelope, warm from the pay office, heavier than it looks. This is not a bank transfer. This is not a number on a screen you barely glance at. This is cash, real notes and coins, folded into paper, pressed into a working man's palm on a Friday in the autumn of 1975. And for the next few hours, that envelope is going to dictate everything. Where he goes, who he sees, what kind of man his family thinks he is. Because here's what nobody tells you about a British working-class Friday night in that era. It wasn't relaxation, it was choreography. Every man in that factory yard knew exactly what came next, in exactly what order, without a single word being spoken. And underneath all of it, quietly, invisibly, something was eating away at the value of that envelope faster than anyone in the pub was willing to admit. Stay with me, because by the end of this you'll understand why so many people who lived through it call it the best of times and the worst of times in the same breath. The walk home itself, or the bus if the factory was far enough out of town, had its own quiet tension to it. A man carrying a week's wages in cash, in his pocket, was carrying something worth protecting, and worth not flashing about too openly on a crowded street or a packed bus home. It was a small, private kind of vigilance that most working men simply carried without ever really naming it, folded in with everything else about a Friday. The first stop for most men wasn't the pub. It was home. Or at least it was supposed to be. The envelope had to be split before it could be spent, and that split was one of the most quietly loaded rituals in British working-class life. A portion went straight to the wife for the housekeeping, rent, coal, food for the week. The rest, the man kept for himself. His beer money, his pool's money, his pocket for the night ahead. Nobody wrote this down anywhere. There was no contract. But in millions of households across England, Scotland and Wales, this division happened every single Friday, and the size of each portion said everything about the balance of power in that marriage. Some women only ever saw a fraction of what their husband actually earned. Some negotiated harder than others. And some Friday nights, that negotiation happened in raised voices before either of them had even left the house. By 5:30, the working man was out the door again, and now the geography of the evening kicked in. British pubs in 1975 did not simply stay open all day the way they do now. Licensing laws, still shaped by rules written decades earlier, meant pubs shut in the afternoon and reopened around 5:30 or 6 in the evening, running through to 10:30 most nights, stretched to 11 only on Fridays and Saturdays. That mattered. It meant Friday night had a start time and an end time, hard borders drawn around the fun, and everyone timed their week around it. You didn't wander into a pub. You marched into one the moment the doors opened, because you only had so many hours before last orders. And the rules weren't even the same everywhere. Exact opening times varied slightly from town to town, decided by local licensing justices rather than a single national timetable. So a pub in one part of the country might close for the afternoon a little earlier or later than 130 miles away. Long parts of Wales, pubs weren't licensed to open at all on a Sunday, a legacy of Sunday closing laws that had been on the books since the previous century. In Scotland, Sunday drinking in a pub was still effectively out of reach for most people in 1975, a restriction that wouldn't be properly loosened until legislation the following year. Friday, in other words, wasn't just the best night to go out. In a lot of Britain, it was one of the only nights where the rules actually let you step inside one of those pubs and the room itself told you where you belonged. Many still kept the old divide between the public bar and the saloon bar, a leftover from an era when the very same building could serve two different classes of customer under one roof. The public bar was plainer, cheaper, rougher around the edges, dartboard on the wall, dominoes and cards on the tables. The saloon just through a partition was a little more comfortable, a little more expensive, for those who wanted to feel a rung above. The air itself was thick, almost solid, with cigarette smoke, because smoking indoors was simply assumed, unremarkable, everywhere. A wooden vending machine by the door sold you a packet for around 30 pence if you'd forgotten your own. The jukebox in the corner ran the soundtrack, coins clinking into the slot between rounds. And in the public bar, darts wasn't just a pastime, it was taken with total seriousness. Teams representing their pub in local leagues, prestige on the line over a few pints and a chalked scoreboard. This was, in fact, exactly the moment darts was quietly becoming something bigger than a taproom game. The British Darts Organisation had been formed only a couple of years earlier, in 1973, and cigarette money, specifically sponsorship from the Embassy brand, was starting to flow into the sport, laying the groundwork for the television tournaments that would turn ordinary pub players into household names within a few more years. Sat at that same sticky table on a Friday night, nobody in the room had any idea they were watching the early, unpolished version of something that would soon be broadcast into millions of living rooms. It was simply their local, their team, their night. But not every man went straight to the pub. Plenty headed instead to the working men's club. And if you didn't grow up in that world, you might not understand the difference. The club was cheaper. The club felt like it belonged to you, because in a sense it did. Built and run by and for people from the same pits, mills and factories, some of them dating back to the 1800s, when workers first pooled together to build a place to drink that wasn't controlled by a brewery. There was bingo. There was a stage with a live act on a Friday, a singer or a comedian working the room between rounds. There was none of the class discomfort you sometimes felt walking into a smarter pub across town. No public bar and saloon bar to remind you which one you belonged in. For a huge number of British communities, especially in the north of England, in Wales, in Scotland's industrial belts, the working men's club was the actual centre of Friday night life, not a pub at all. Entire streets would empty into the same club on the same night, generations of the same families sitting at the same tables their fathers had sat at. There was also an unspoken code around who belonged where, and it fell hard along lines of gender as much as class. A woman drinking alone in the rougher public bar could still draw disapproving looks in plenty of towns, which is a large part of why the more comfortable saloon bar, or the working men's club, or the bingo hall down the road, so often became the female half of the same Friday night ritual, rather than the same room the men were standing in. Respectability, in 1975, still had very specific, very local rules about where a woman was and wasn't meant to be seen enjoying herself, and most people navigated those rules without ever needing to be told them out loud. Underneath all of this sat something worth remembering too, because it complicates the picture rather than simplifying it. For all the financial strain, an unskilled working man in 1975 could still, realistically, rent a council house and support a family on his wage alone, something that would become far harder for the same kind of household in the decades that followed. The Friday night ritual wasn't built on desperation. It was built on a working-class life that was genuinely difficult, squeezed hard by inflation, but not yet the precarious, insecure existence it would become once the industries underneath it started disappearing for good. For families who went out together, there was a version of this ritual too, and it had its own strict unspoken rule. Children were not allowed inside a pub, so a huge number of British kids in 1975 spent part of their Friday evening sitting on a step outside, or in a pub garden if the place had one, nursing a bottle of lemonade or dandelion and burdock, a packet of crisps in hand, the little twist of blue paper salt tipped in and shaken about before it was opened. Their father would slip out every so often to check on them, pint still in hand, before heading back inside to finish the round. It's a memory that still surfaces, decades later, whenever people who lived through it start swapping stories about their childhood. Now, before we go further into the night, if you're enjoying uncovering the details of everyday British life that history books tend to skip over, hit subscribe now. This channel exists to dig up exactly this kind of forgotten texture, the small rituals that shaped millions of ordinary lives, and you won't want to miss what comes later in this video. Drop a comment telling me which part of this Friday night ritual your own family still talks about, and if this is bringing back memories, share it with someone who'd remember it too. Whichever door a man walked through, pub or club, There was still a piece of paper waiting to be filled in before the night really began. The football pool's coupon. At its peak in the 1970s, somewhere between 14 and 16 million coupons were being posted off across Britain every single week, mostly to two great rival firms, Littlewoods and Vernon's, both born out of Liverpool decades earlier, and grown into vast postal empires employing thousands of women just to process the results. You picked your matches, you guessed your draws, hunting for that elusive line of scoreless games, and for the price of a few pence, you bought yourself a genuine, if microscopic, chance at changing your entire life by Saturday tea time. It wasn't really about the football, it was about the fantasy. For one evening a week, a factory hand, a miner, a docker, could sit with a pencil and dream, seriously dream, about walking away from the job on Monday morning forever. Mums never won more than a few pounds in their whole lives, if that. It didn't matter. The ritual of filling it in, folding it, posting it before the Friday deadline, the hope carried in that envelope, was worth the price entirely on its own. In plenty of streets you didn't even need to walk to a post box. A local collector, known simply as the poolsman, would call door to door, gathering the completed coupons along with a few pence in payment, and leaving next week's blank coupon behind before moving on to the next house. It was often a second job entirely, a man finishing his own full day's work at a factory or an office before heading out again into the evening to walk his round of streets, sometimes not getting home himself until well past 10 at night. Whole neighbourhoods came to know their poolsman by name, trusted him with their money and their weekly dream in equal measure, and thought nothing at all of it. By the time the pub or the club was in full swing, appetite would start creeping in, and there was really only one answer to that in working-class Britain: the chip shop. The chippy tea on a Friday night wasn't just dinner, it was practically a national institution, cheap enough that even on the tightest budget, a wrapped parcel of fried fish and chips, doused in vinegar, was within reach of almost anyone with a few coins left in their pocket. Britain had tens of thousands of these shops by the middle of the decade, on nearly every high street, in nearly every side street. The queue on a Friday night was its own social event, neighbours catching up while they waited, the smell of hot oil and vinegar drifting halfway down the road. For plenty of families, it was the one night of the week nobody had to cook. But here's the detail that gets left out of the nostalgia. Those prices, so cheap they sound like a joke today, were already creeping upward year after year through the 1970s, because the cost of everything underneath them, the fish, the cooking oil, the flour for the batter, was climbing too, squeezed by the same oil crisis and currency troubles that were hitting every other part of the economy. Cod and chips had cost 1 shilling and 6pence in old money at the start of the decade, worth about 7.5 pence once decimalisation arrived in early 1971, and within just a couple of years the same order had climbed to somewhere around 15 pence. To anyone doing the sums at the counter with change in their hand, that wasn't a small rise. It was a doubling, inside a handful of years, for the exact same parcel of fish and chips. For those who stayed home, or who got back from the pub before 10, there was still a ritual waiting in the front room: the television. And in 1975 specifically, something changed that mattered more than people realized at the time. For a stretch of that year from September onward, the BBC's flagship music show Top of the Pops moved from its usual Thursday slot to Friday evenings instead. For millions of households, that meant Friday night now had a soundtrack built into it. Families gathered around one television set, because most homes only had the one, watching the week's chart hits performed live in the studio, along with the show's regular dance troupe interpreting whichever record hadn't sent its artists in to perform. It was one of the only moments in the week when teenagers and their parents sat in front of the same screen, watching the same thing, even if they didn't agree on a single song between them. And for those who genuinely couldn't be bothered leaving the house at all, there was Watney's Party 7, A squat red and gold can holding roughly 7 pints of draft bitter, first launched back in 1968, and by the mid-70s a fixture of home gatherings across working-class Britain. Opening one properly required a hammer and a nail, 2 holes punched through thick tin, one to let the beer out and one to let the air in, and getting it wrong meant a fountain of beer across the front room carpet rather than into anybody's glass. The beer itself was by most honest accounts nothing special. That was never really the point. The point was 9 pints arriving in a single tin, cheap enough and communal enough to turn an ordinary front room into a party without anyone needing to put a coat on. Turn on that one household television for Top of the Pops on a Friday that December, and you'd have caught something genuinely historic without realizing it in the moment. On the 4th of December 1975, Jimmy Savile introduced a chart rundown with Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody sitting at number 1, played through as a video rather than performed live in the studio, right at the start of a run at the top of the charts that would become one of the most talked about in British chart history. Whatever was happening at the bar, whatever was happening at the bingo hall, that same 6 minutes of music was reaching almost every household in the country at once. There was one more layer to that Friday night atmosphere that rarely makes it into the nostalgia, and it's worth being honest about. Less than a year earlier, in November 1974, bombs planted in 2 Birmingham pubs had killed 21 people on an ordinary night out, part of a wave of attacks that had brought Northern Ireland's conflict onto the British mainland. Pub landlords and regulars across the country carried that memory with them into 1975. A busy pub on a Friday night was still, for most people, an act of ordinary trust, but it was trust that had been tested, and nobody who'd been drinking regularly through that period pretended otherwise. The ritual carried on. It simply carried on with a little more awareness than it once had. So picture the whole town, all at once, on the same night. Men in the pub or the club, darts thudding into the board, pools coupons already sealed and posted. Women at bingo, or managing the housekeeping money at home, or doing both in the same evening. Teenagers glued to Top of the Pops, a chippy queue stretching out the door and halfway down the street. It looks on the surface like a community entirely at ease with itself, comfortable, predictable, content, and that's exactly the picture that gets sold back to us now, in soft focus, as simpler times. But here's what that soft focus conveniently leaves out. 1975 was by any measure one of the most financially brutal years the British working class had lived through in living memory. Inflation that year hit 24.2%, not 2.4, 24.2. Long 1973 oil crisis had already sent the cost of petrol soaring, and that shock rippled outward into the cost of transporting food, running factories, heating homes. Bread doubled in price within a couple of years. House prices trebled across the decade. The average manual worker's wage sat somewhere around £25 to £30 a week. The average weekly pay packet nationally was still under £40, and the government of the day, wrestling with a currency in crisis and a country on the edge of real panic about where prices were heading, was pushing what it called the social contract, an agreement with the trade unions to hold down pay rises across the country in exchange for a promise to bring prices back under control. Of the government of the day. That summer in July, it hardened into something much more direct, a flat limit of £6 a week on any pay increase, whatever a person's job or income already was. Not everyone walked out of the factory gates with the same envelope either. Earlier that same year, some hospital workers had secured pay awards approaching 60%, and miners had won rises of around 35%. While plenty of other trades were left negotiating for far less or nothing at all. So the Friday night ritual, the same pub, the same coupon, the same chippy queue, was being lived out by men whose actual financial position that year could be wildly different from the bloke standing next to them at the bar, even if neither of them ever discussed it out loud. It sounded on paper like a fair and simple solution. In practice, for the men filling in their pools, coupons, and standing at the bar with their pint, it meant one thing above all else. Even that £6 ceiling wasn't enough to keep pace with prices rising at a quarter every year, and real wages, what that money actually bought once the shopping was done, would go on to fall by more than 10% over the second half of the decade. Which means that envelope, the one that felt so solid and satisfying in a man's hand at 6 o'clock on a Friday, was already losing its real value before the ink on the payslip had even dried. He didn't feel it that same night. Nobody does. The pint still tasted the same. The chips still filled you up. The pool's coupon cost the same few pence it always had. The darts match was won or lost exactly as it would have been the year before. Long but month by month, that same envelope was buying a little less than it had the month before, and almost nobody standing at the bar, glass in hand, was talking about it out loud. It was easier, and arguably kinder to yourself, to enjoy the one evening you had, than to sit calculating what the inflation figures actually meant for the rest of your year. That's the part of this story that rarely gets told honestly. The Friday night ritual we now remember so fondly wasn't a sign of comfortable, stable working-class life. In many ways it was closer to the opposite. It was a release valve, one single evening a week where people spent freely, briefly, almost defiantly, precisely because the rest of the week, and the rest of the year, felt increasingly squeezed by forces well beyond their control. The working man in the pub wasn't ignoring the inflation crisis gripping the country. He was in his own quiet way, refusing to let it touch this one evening. The woman filling in her bingo card wasn't unaware that the housekeeping money bought less than it used to. She was claiming one night that belonged to her regardless of what the numbers said. Long defiance, that insistence on keeping the ritual alive even as the figures underneath it worsened, is arguably the most human part of this entire story. It's also worth saying plainly what came after, because none of this survived intact. Through the decades that followed, the working men's clubs began closing their doors one by one, as the industries that had built them, the pits, the mills, the shipyards, were themselves shut down through the 1980s. A club built by miners for miners doesn't have much of a future once the pit at the end of the road is gone. The football pools, once posted by 14 to 16 million households every single week at the peak of the 1970s and 80s, saw their numbers fall to around 9 million by the start of the 1990s, and then collapse far further once the National Lottery arrived in November 1994, offering a bigger dream for the same few pence a coupon had always cost. Pub numbers across Britain have fallen sharply too in the years since, squeezed by changing habits, cheaper supermarket alcohol, and economics that no longer favored a pub on every corner the way they once did. The strict old licensing hours themselves were eventually swept away, loosened through the late 1980s, and then rewritten entirely by the Licensing Act of 2003, which allowed pubs to apply for hours stretching right around the clock. The very borders that once gave Friday night its shape, that 5:30 start, that 10:30 or 11 finish, simply stopped existing. The Friday night we've just walked through together, that exact sequence of the envelope split at the kitchen table, the pub or the club, the coupon posted before the deadline, the chippy queue, the family gathered round one television set for Top of the Pops, the bingo hall packed with women claiming their one evening of the week, all of it happening in the same few hours across thousands of British towns simultaneously, simply doesn't exist in that form anymore. It couldn't survive the disappearance of the industries and the communities that built it, piece by piece, over the following 20 years. So the next time you hear someone talk about 1975 with a soft, nostalgic smile, remember what was actually underneath that Friday night. Real hardship, real financial pressure, worse than almost any year before or since. A country still genuinely uneasy, in places, about walking into its own pubs. And yet, in the middle of all of it, real people who built, out of very little, a weekly ritual that gave their lives shape, dignity, and one evening of genuine joy, regardless of what the numbers were doing to them behind the scenes. That's not a simpler time. That's a harder time, carried with more grace than it's usually given credit for. If this kind of forgotten British history means something to you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what we uncover next. Tell me in the comments which part of this Friday night stayed with you the most. Whether it was the envelope split at the table, the pool's coupon, the chippy queue, or sitting outside the pub with a bottle of pop as a child. Give this video a like if it took you somewhere you hadn't expected, and share it with someone who'd remember these Friday nights exactly as they really were.